3:34 in the AM here at the Bellagio, just wrapping up one of the more unbelievable sessions. Definitely in a long while, and possibly ever for myself here at the Bellagio. 5-10 unlimited hold thems. Things definitely started off on the modest, if not more rocky side, playing six-handed. The under the gun player opens up for $30. We look down at ace queen suited immediately next to act. Usually I'm not one to 3-bet the under the gun opener. We are six-handed, and we do have maybe one of the most likely hands that I think I could 3-bet with in this spot. Still going to play okay even when we do get called. We could even possibly maybe even call a 4-bet with this. I decide to flat though. I take my standard relatively wide flat call range versus the under the gun player when I am next player to act. A lot of hands are going to go into my flat call range, including very strong hands. I put this one in there as well this time, and the player on my left calls, and the big blind calls as well. So 4 of us opt to see a flop. Ace-6 deuce, 2 hearts, 1 club. So we flop pretty well here. Top pair, strong kicker, backdoor flush possibilities. Action checks over to me. I think a wager's pretty standard here. I bet $70. Player on my left makes the call before the player, and the big blind puts in a check raise. Decent size, up to $300. This player is a good regular player here in the Bellagio 510. Also plays a lot online. Either way, I think we have a pretty standard flat call here, and the player on my left calls again. Turn is interesting. It's the ace of spades, so that's going to give us trips, strong kicker. My opponent in the big blind is undeterred, continues firing into 2 opponents here on the turn, this time $500. Still think the flat call here is most standard. Don't really see a whole lot of value in raising, and folding out of the question, of course. So I put in the flat call, and this time my opponent on my left, he folds. So heads up to a river card in a pot that is growing significantly. Unfortunately, we do not see any improvement on the river. It's a jack of clubs, and our opponent is going to make it pretty tough on us. He's going to rip it all in here. We're still pretty deep. Heading into this river card, we're about $1,900 effective. So my opponent is basically representing 6s full, deuces full, ace-6, and ace-deuce. I don't expect him to have ace-jack here, so that's pretty much out of the question. Pocket jack's out of the question. That's about it, though. And I guess he's probably going to have ace-6 and ace-deuce more than I am. I don't think I'm going to have those hands all that often. I'll have the ace-6 suited and ace-deuce suited combo sometimes, but he can call even with some offsuit varieties of those hands, closing the action in the big blind. Pretty tough spot here. The old Andrew would pretty much always default to a call here. I go into the tank for a very long time. This entire hand lasts somewhere around 5 or 5.5 minutes altogether. The one piece of information that I guess I rely on in this hand in particular is the fact that the player on my left, who also called the check raise behind me on the flop, he's probably going to have 2 hearts there a lot of the time. Once we see the 3rd ace on the turn, probably not going to find too many overcalls on the flop with a ragged ace. So with him calling that check raise on the flop, it's going to pretty often mean that he has 2 hearts in his hand, which I think is going to eliminate some of the flush draw combos, some of the combo draw type of holdings that the big blind can have in this hand. So I don't know. It's pretty close. It feels not great to fold here. I think we're usually going to have a little bit less strong of an ace here when we flat call, and I think my opponent might be underestimating the strength of our hand here. That being said, we can have some better hands here. We can have pocket 6s, we can have pocket deuces, we can have some full houses here, and we can even have ace-jack. So we're not necessarily at the very top of our range here. Long-winded hand discussion here, but I eventually decided to fold, which means we don't get to see whether it's a good fold or a bad fold. We don't get to see the results of this hand. We save our $1,900 for another battle. That's what happens when you play against good players. They're going to put you in some tough spots. All right, moving off of that game into a different game, onto a different table. On this table, we're playing 8-handed, and in this hand, the hijack player raises it up to $30 before we look down at 8-7 suited in the small blind. happy to call here, even though we're out of position, $30. We're somewhere around $2,000 effective in this hand, so plenty to play for with a suited connector. I make the call. Big blind, however, puts in a 3-bet this time up to $150. Player in the hijack gets out of the way, and maybe a little iffy here to continue with a suited connector, being out of position, 3-bet hand, but still plenty deep here, and I feel like I have a pretty good read on the situation with this player. And as far as his range goes, I think he's going to be pretty face up here in this spot. I don't think he's going to be doing this with worse than ace king or somewhere between jacks and queens plus. So jacks, queens, kings, aces, and ace king I think are the only real likely hands in this spot. So with all that in mind, and you know, looking to play some hands, obviously we came to play poker, and folding is my least favorite part about poker. Anyway, we make the call, and we are heads up to a flop, which comes down, not all that helpful for us, comes down ace high. I check it, and my opponent checks it back. So feeling like I, again, have a pretty good read on where my opponent might be in this hand. Turn is the 6 of hearts, which is pretty interesting because it puts up a second flush draw, but it also gives us a double gutter now. So if we're going to start to tell a story, I think the moment is now. Betting here serves two purposes. A, our opponent will fold on some occasions, maybe not all that often to one bet, but B, it allows us to set up 2 barrels worth of aggression when we don't improve on the river. So I'm going to go ahead and bet here. Don't necessarily need to bet too big. If I happen to have a hand like ace jack or something of the sort, it's going to be a way ahead or way behind situation. So I think I'm just going to go ahead and bet about 140 bucks here. My opponent thinks for a little bit and makes the call off to a river card, which does not improve us, an offsuit jack. So again, with 2 flush draws on the turn, with my opponent having somewhat of a narrow range here, and not putting in any further aggression, facing that small bet on the turn, again, I feel like I have a pretty good read on where he's at. So I'm going to give it a shot. I'm going to bet the second barrel here. I bet $330, which I'm not too sure how ideal of a sizing that is. I think when we size up a little bit, we put a lot more pressure on a hand such as pocket queens and pocket kings, maybe size up a little bit closer to the full pot. My opponent thinks for a pretty long time, and I actually think in the moment that it's not going to work out. I think we're going to have to showdown this 8 high, which isn't the worst thing in the world. It helps develop a reputation. But as it turns out, my opponent lets it go. So it doesn't come to that. Get the job done with $330 wager in the end. Yeah, I don't know. Not saying it's the best wager, not saying it's the best line. Calling a 3-bet out of position, maybe not super solid poker being played. This hand works out at least. All right, let's get on to some absolute epicness, shall we? In this hand, I have the straddle on under the gun. There's 2 limpers before the player in the small blind puts in a min raise. $40 to go. We look down at Jack 10 offsuit in the straddle, always calling here for the min raise, and both of the limpers make the call as well. So going 4 ways to a flop, which comes down kind of favorable for this Jack 10. It comes down Jack 10, 3, 2 diamonds. This time the player in the small blind checks, which is pretty interesting because I would expect this player to have a pretty strong hand. Several players on this table, it seemed like, were kind of often limping when they were maybe on the weaker side, raising bigger when they were on the stronger side, or maybe raising at all when they were on the stronger side. Anyway, with this type of a flop, I'm definitely going to bet over $100. There's so many straight draws plus the flush draw, lots of hands that can continue. So I put out a bet of $110. Could even go a little bit more, I think. $170 there going into the flop in the pot. So I think we could even bet larger, but $110 it is. Player on my direct left calls, player on the button folds, and the player in the small blind, who was the pre-flop raiser, is going to shove the full stack in there, which is not that big of a stack, about $450. This time it is going all into the middle, the check raise all in. I don't necessarily think we just want a flat call here with the player on my left flat calling. As mentioned, so many drawing hands available. I don't think we want to give too attractive of a price to the player on my left. So I think another raise is in order. I make it somewhere around the min raise. I slide 8 black chips out there, which is enough for the min raise. This is where things get very interesting. The player on my left goes into the tank, checks his cards, checks the board, thinking before deciding to wager all of his chips. We are kind of on the deep side here. I think we're somewhere around $2,500 effective, maybe even more. I have about $2,900 in my stack, but I cover the player on my left. So after putting in $800 on the flop, plenty of draws available on this flop. It doesn't dawn on me to even go into the tank. We're just going to go ahead and call this off here. We're just going to have to snap it off. I think there's so many combo draws that my opponent can have, and I think after raising to $800 would just be a mistake. So we're going to get it in there with top 2 pair, and my opponent on my left and I are going to run it twice for the side pot. The player in the small blind wants to only run it once for the main pot. So we're off to see a couple turns and rivers here for a pretty big side pot. The turn and river on the first board runs out diamond, diamond, which means we end up making a flush. And on the second board, turn is a king and the river is a jack. So we end up with a full house on the second board. Feeling pretty good about that second board, at least. The cards are revealed, and it turns out the player in the small blind has pocket kings. So that hand is going to scoop the main pot. However, the player on my left has pocket 3s, which means we are going to scoop versus that player. Pretty ridiculous hand here. That player ends up in last place on all the boards, in all the spots. We make a flush on the first board to crack the bottom set, and we make a full house to beat 3s full on the second board. This is a massive pot here. This is a huge pot. Pretty damn near 300 big blinds effective with the player on my left. Unfortunately, we lose to the pocket kings that get there with the better flush on the first board. So we lose $450 to that player. However, we win a huge pot versus the pocket 3s, bottom set versus top 2, and a pretty sick one. We mow it down twice. This ends up being quite the session. I don't know how many full houses, I don't know how many flushes. It was a lot though. This is one of those sessions where everything clicks, aside from that first hand where I made a big fold. The only question is, was I supposed to call there because this session just had my name written all over it? Or was that the run bad that led to just enormous amounts of run good? Get into the game for $1,800, cash out $6,175, profit of $4,375. That, my friends, pretty reasonably good day of poker.